Welcome, everyone, to the latest I4CP Next Practices weekly event. We hold these every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. Great to be with you once again. Great to see so many returning names and faces, as well as some new folks joining the call this week. If you haven't already done so, please use the chat, introduce yourself there, let us know maybe what organization you're with, where you're joining from. And then keep the chat open. We'll be using that throughout the call today. That's your way of interacting with our guest. We are I4CP. We're the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that truly drive high performance. We do this in several different ways, but one chief way is through our quantitative studies, where we survey the HR community on a broad range of topics, always trying to tease out what high-performance companies are doing different than their low-performing counterparts. You see here our definition of high performance, 4 fairly standard business metrics, and we like to find both best practices and what we call next practices, those things that high-performing companies do more than low performers, but that overall we don't see happening too often. So we're helping you to see around the curve. We primarily are focused on our I4CP member organizations. You see here just a small sampling of the logos of some of these companies. They range from very large organizations like Amazon, Nike, 3M, Microsoft, Accenture, and others. Also a lot of smaller companies. We have a growing cohort of unicorn startup organizations. They also span across all different market industry verticals, from healthcare to banking to manufacturing, retail, high tech, you name it. Special welcome to everyone on the call who's with an I4CP member organization. Great to have you with us. If you're not with a member organization but would like to learn more about what that entails, what the benefits are, just reach out to me or anyone else at I4CP, and we'd be happy to give you that information. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I have the pleasure most weeks of co-hosting this event. This week, I'm joined by our Chief Research Officer, Kevin Martin. Good morning, Kevin.
Hello, Tom. Good to see you, as always.
Good to be with you. You're going to be leading the conversation with our special guest, who we'll introduce in just a moment. But a couple of other preliminaries here real quick. As I've said, this is Next Practices Weekly. We meet every Thursday. You see some of the upcoming events that we've got lined up. That next one actually should say February 22nd, I'm now noticing. But the 22nd, the 29th, March 4th, you see a great lineup of additional guests, all of whom, as is the case with our guest today, are going to be speakers at our conference coming up. So more on that to come. We also have some sessions that are on days of the week and times, more importantly, a little bit different than 11 a.m. Eastern. And these are for your global counterparts, your global colleagues that maybe are in the APAC or EMEA regions. We hold these once a month. So we'd encourage you share this with people at your organization or just other industry colleagues who maybe are located in Asia, Australia, Europe, Middle East. And we cover a lot of the same HR topics that are critical around the globe. One thing that we're going to be focused on in our conversation today is, of course, AI, generative AI in particular. Wanted to note we've done multiple studies on this over the years, but of course, over the past 18 months, it's been on everyone's mind. Our study, Is HR Already Behind in the AI Revolution? Was sort of a groundbreaking update to previous work we've done in this area. The full member report is available to I4CP members, but there's also a brief that's available. We've also done some sessions here at Next Practices Weekly. If you go back in the archive, all of these sessions are available with slides, with recordings and notes available. So I'd encourage you to peruse the archive to learn more, as well as download either the full report or the public brief. And Zeta is putting the links to these, and watch the chat. She'll be linking to various things throughout the call today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Kevin, to introduce today's special guest.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it very much. And hello to Zeta, as always, who's trying to hide in the background, but she's wonderful. And but I am super stoked. I see that Diane stepped out for a moment. She was getting coffee, by the way. She had told us that she was getting coffee brewed, so she'll be right back. But I'm super excited about this. What I'm going to do, Tom, is just tee up a few things as as well, shoot, Diane's back here. So I'll make sure that I told everyone, Diane, I said, don't worry, Diane's getting her coffee. She told us that she had some
Exactly what
coffee
happened.
brewing.
I apologize.
That's okay. We all do that. And priorities come first. But Diane, we're going to start just with your introduction. I think most everyone in this call, if they've never had the chance to meet you, they've certainly heard about you. And we are super excited. And if you can just share with people a little bit about your journey from HR, and many of us on the call know you from your incredible stint as the CHRO at IBM to being on 3 company boards right now. Can you tell us about that journey and about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and welcome to everybody. I can see some people are in California like me and enjoying the better weather. My condolences to everyone else who's buried in snow. Yeah, I joined IBM in 2002 out of consulting. I'd been running the employee pay practice at Towers Watson. And I thought I was going into a corporate lifestyle, but no, it was more intense. I was surrounded by incredibly bright people, and it was an incredible journey actually going there. I joined as the head of compensation and benefits. So I sort of I came in with a $30 billion portfolio that I had to manage, and was part of IBM's HR leadership team for quite a while. I was head of talent and head of HR for one of the businesses, and learned HR in the process because I'd only been in consulting before that. And then in 2013, I became head of HR. And it was an exciting time because it was a time to rebuild the culture into one of growth after years and years of productivity focus. And we changed the portfolio, and it was, as I said, a really exciting time. And for me, my 2 best friends were AI and design thinking. And so I really relied on both of those to shape a different culture, which meant everything, right? Leadership, how we work, how we interact, how we communicate. All of those things changed during that time. And it was just a really, really exciting time to be there. And of course, I was so lucky to have Watson to work with. I had first started working with AI when I was head of talent. And that was about 10 years ago, and used it to infer skills because we were moving very quickly into upskilling and reskilling, and understanding skills as sort of the fundamental denominator of HR. And so as I said, AI was my friend, which is why I'm excited to be talking about it today. And design thinking, which of course puts the user at the center and focuses on really drawing the wisdom of everyone as opposed to a top-down form of change.
We're gonna, so as Diane's teed up here, we're gonna really have a great opportunity here to tap into her deep expertise, especially with AI and HR. And we're going to explore that in a moment. But Diane, you also are gracious enough to not only be a speaker at our upcoming conference. So I'm putting a plug in here for our conference, best conference on the planet. And you should find yourself, if you're an HR leader, you need to be in Scottsdale at the end of March. And Diane, you're going to be talking about, just to tee it up, culture and human capital risk within, at the board level, right? In your experience being a board director and a CHRO at the conference, you've also been gracious enough to give time to spend with our CHRO board the day before at a board meeting of our CHROs in Scottsdale as well. Can you just quickly talk about what inspired you to want to make the transition when you retired from IBM into the corporate boardroom, or what was it that lured you in so much? Just curious.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think as I experienced in the pandemic, the board suddenly got interested in a much more intense way in issues that HR really is responsible for, right? And, you know, it was the first time I'd ever heard board members ask questions like, you know, how are your people doing? You know, so it was a bit of an eye opener for me. And I had, you know, over the course of when I was head of HR, experienced a number of things like that. The first one was really #MeToo. When that came along, I felt it was my responsibility to talk with them about what we were doing about it. Not that we had, you know, serious cases of any sexual harassment, but bullying was an issue. And it was, you know, part of a culture that had grown up over many, many years. And we all know that what happens there, you've got people who grew up with that. And so they role model it back. And of course, you know, the millennial generation was pushing back really hard, and #MeToo was a great example of how, you know, they really made it clear, we're not going to work in this kind of organization. And so, you know, I had worked with the employees to put together a new code of conduct around, you know, being really specific. And we had a code of conduct, and it had served itself very well, but you could have, you know, driven through the definitions with a truck, you know, I mean, there was like nothing, it wasn't really clear. So, you know, so to be able to talk to the board about, you know, here's our definition of, you know, romantic relationships at work, here's our definition, you know, blah, 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 what you do in each instance and where you draw the line. And they were really leaning in. I obviously hadn't had these discussions in their companies yet, but they were a little nervous about having these conversations, you know, and I realized this is key because it's killing companies. I mean, you'd seen all these, you know, terrible brand damage situations that clearly had affected the share price of some companies, and we won't mention them here, but, you know, and other issues, of course, that had come up earlier, you know, that had been about culture and how culture had gotten in the way of a brand or a reputation. So, so I was, you know, I'd had some experience with that, but I realized COVID was actually changing that even more. And sure enough, that is what I've discovered is there is a huge interest in having people with an HR background who understand how to make change, who understand leadership, and who, you know, really are attuned to issues around human capital. And, you know, there's just been, I mean, it just goes on, right? They're picking, you know, CEOs who turn out they have, you know, something in their closets and, you know, that kind of thing. And they're just constantly stumbling. I think, you know, obviously the latest example of Boeing was a culture issue, right? And there was the board, you know, again, you know, not looking so smart about what had been going on in the company. And it's important that people on the board ask the right questions, and they realize that. So I think it's a very exciting time to be on boards.
I love that, and what really resonates with me in particular, Diane, is what you said about the definition. You could drive a truck through that, and I think for so many companies, and this is Tom, if we could just transition, I want to show a couple of slides here. Diane hasn't seen these slides, by the way, so we're not throwing these out there just to catch you off guard or anything. This is really teeing up more about the conversation you'll lead at our conference. But what we have found is definitions around culture, definitions around productivity, the same thing. You could drive a truck through that in most boardrooms. And so what we're seeing out there is this demand among investors, all stakeholders, board directors, et cetera, for really narrow, tight definitions about what you mean. And here's what I want to share. So, and Zeta will put links. So if you're an I4CP member, then the images of these next two reports are going to be ones that you can access. This is a study we did last year, and it was well over 100 or about 100 corporate board directors. We asked them about human capital data that they have access to, human capital data they find valuable but they don't have access to. And you can see where culture health ranks up top. But what I put little marks around here is what we find, and Diane, I'd love just or your reaction to this. What we have found mostly when talking to corporate board directors is they might even get some of this data from the CHRO, but they're not getting this. They're not getting an integrated picture as to what it all means. So for instance, I circled like internal movement rate, reputation as an employer, employee net promoter score, and voluntary attrition of high performers. our research shows that those are metrics that denote at some of the best organizations their culture health. So those are the leading indicators to that culture health metric that they're putting up to the board. But many CHROs don't paint that picture. They just might give them a data point in that regard. I'm just curious if you had a reaction to this.
Yeah, no,
these
are very good. These are very good. One of the things that I did at IBM was every quarter in the board meeting, I would present, is our employee workforce better caliber this quarter than it was last quarter? And better caliber meant things like diversity, inclusion, engagement, skills in the critical areas, turnover rate of our high performers, all of those things that suggested that we were getting better and better. And we also compared it to our competitors. So, so yes, were we better than last quarter, but how are we doing versus our competitors? Are we better in blockchain? Are we, all the sort of critical skills that we had? And that did make a difference because, I think there was a tendency in the past to only present what you're really good at, and not show what, what you're still working on. And it was a project with the board that we really wanted to have the highest caliber workforce in all the areas that matter to us. And it was a journey, and so I think that's important to share a journey with a board as opposed to just sort of showing off your good numbers, which at the end of the day gets them kind of frustrated because it's like, well, what are you not showing me?
Right. And I would think that goes a long way to building the board's trust in the CHRO, and which is absolutely essential. So just Tom, the next slide here real quick. So I just this is a report actually that's available to everyone. If you don't have our priorities and predictions report that we published, well over a month ago, this is available to everyone. But I just wanted to put another point of emphasis as to why we're so excited about having Diane speak at our conference. Look at what Columbia Business School came out with recently. This is back in January, where their own research says that culture is the biggest off-balance sheet asset for a company. And then, of course, the NACD has been trumpeting this for a long time, but they're talking about how it is a unifying force that drives business value. And then what I left off there was the sentence follows that says, and if you have an unhealthy culture, it's one of your biggest liabilities. And so again, this is so critical. And that's why we put forth the prediction that these are going to be now expected. You need to be tight, buttoned up, and you need to have an integrated story behind it. And then Tom, the last one, and Diane, this I think really tees us up well for where we're going to go with the AI piece. This is another study. This is based on data we captured from just about 110 corporate board directors who are partner, Extraordinary Women on Boards, back in Q4 of last year. And we were asking about AI in the boardroom. And what I'm showing right here is something that I think really, and Dan, I'd love your take on this, because to me, this really exemplifies two things. One is many CHROs are unable to really tell an effective story. They might have data again, but they're not sharing the story effectively. And the CHRO can play a demonstrable role in helping the company shape its AI strategy. And so what we're seeing here on the data, what it's showing is if you pay attention, or if you draw your attention just to the right-hand side, not confident. You could see we asked the board directors, what level of confidence do you have? And think about just one company you serve on. And so they thought about one private or public company. And they said, 42% said that we are not confident the company is effectively upskilling or reskilling its workers for the future. Only 9% were confident. And then the other one I circled, 41% were not confident that the company management was communicating a vision about how generative AI might affect the organization going forward, versus only 16% confident. And again, I think it gets back to that storytelling and the ability, especially for the first one, to share effective data and paint the picture. And I'm just wondering for your reaction just to this, Diane, before we get into your AI journey.
Yeah, I think this is a good list. I think unlike other forms of technology that perhaps have been a little out of the ordinary, Gen AI, is something that everyone's been using for a long time, right? Whether they're customer of a company that has customer care that, you know, uses
Yeah,
Gen
it's a
AI or
bot.
whatever. So
Mhm.
I think people are not, it's not as foreign to them as, you know, cloud computing or something like that. And I do think people are quite used to fooling around with technology that seems accessible. And I think the big breakthrough was to be able to use it since October of 2022 when it became available, you know, to the public. And so, you know, that last one, encouraging employees to identify work tasks, you got to believe they've already done that. You know, the question is, did they do it, you know, formally and tell people about it, or are they
Yes.
just doing it to help them get their jobs done? And so I think that one's an interesting one to get to. Encouragement is good because they know it's okay. But of course, you've got to show them the guardrails that that you're using as a company and what's okay and what isn't okay. And I guess that belongs in the communicating the vision. And not just the organization of the industry, but also, you know, what are the guardrails that we're going to use as a company to make sure that we maintain privacy and confidentiality of data and avoid, you know, hacking and all those sorts of good things. But I do think that last one is so important because the wisdom is in the crowd, right? It's just not a top-down wisdom about how to do that.
I think that's great. And it goes a long way to your point too about just overall, I would think it has a tremendous positive effect on decreasing the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? That they're conjuring up themselves, or they might be reading about of, well, geez, this is going to replace me, right? Or, well, what's my future hold, etc. So Diane,
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
that's a great point. I
yeah,
mean, yep,
no, please,
go
I
ahead.
interrupted you.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of fear about losing jobs, and there's a lot of sort of silly comments like new job is going to be prompt engineer. Like we don't know how to do that ourselves. So you know, so I think people are, you know, vastly overestimating some of the change that'll happen. You know, I can just say my experience with Gen AI is that it does free people up from the less interesting parts of their job, frankly, and some people are fearful that they're not able to take on the new stuff, pattern finding and that sort of thing. And so that's the part that takes some work on the part of HR is to build their confidence, give them the training. I'll give you an example that what we had with Gen AI was it enabled the people who had been working in the customer service area with the employee service area to actually connect the dots that they hadn't ever spent time on that would alert the people who ran the centers of excellence around issues with their design. And that hadn't happened nearly to the extent you would have wanted to because they were in the here and now, you know, cutting, pasting, all that kind of thing to get stuff done. So I do think there's, you know, there's a higher bar that's being asked of people, but most people are capable of it. They just never really had the space and time to do those more interesting parts of their jobs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know, you know, skills is clearly an area that you're very passionate about, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Can you, Diane, also talk about, you know, you have shared before, and I love these examples where you said, you know, like for instance, it allowed us, and so many companies have listening strategies out there, but how did AI or generative AI allow you to sense and respond better, either as an HR function or as a company?
Yeah, you know, this is such an interesting topic, Kevin. I just blogged about it yesterday, actually, because I saw an article, it was NBC, one of those articles, right, that was about, oh gosh, corporate snooping. You know, this is Orwellian, and it's appropriate that people are worried about it. But you know, for years, companies have used you know, AI in some form, often, you know, through a third party to help them discern if there's any insider trading going on, if there's any threats of violence in the workplace. These are things that are serious, right? And so to be able to have some form of alert is important. Okay, so we've got that. And then, AI, of course, and Gen AI enables you to look at everything, video, text, Slack, not just emails, which tended to be what they looked at before. And so there's this sense that it will stop people from working, they'll hold back, right? And I agree, they will hold back if you're not absolutely transparent about how you're using it. Name identification you would only use if there was the threat of workplace violence or some other crime, right? And that would be that you'd need some form of governance to make sure that it's not just a whimsical idea. Let's just go see who that person is, and it could be something bad, but not not something really bad like workplace violence. So to have governance and even involve your employees in the governance, do it, because that gives them confidence that it's not, some Orwellian, conspiracy that is out there. But certainly, it does enable you to pick up any patterns of negativity. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, who was it? Oracle? No, I've forgotten, one of the software companies had decided to move one of their conferences to Florida, and 500 of their employees went out and protested it. Well, that's not something you really want to have crashing the headlines if your consumers see that, and it was maybe something they could have been preemptive about if they'd known that there was this negativity around that decision. They could have done something to talk with their employees about it, explain why, hear their side, all this kind of thing, right? But this is causing companies to be flat-footed, right? When they don't know that there's something really negative going on. And I think in the world before social media, that was okay. But with the world of social media, it gets oxygen, and you're the one on the defense as a company. And so, so there is a need to understand it. But again, not getting to the individual. My first experience with it was actually in 2014. I was getting off a plane. I was new in my job as CHRO. And I had about 3 messages from my assistant. And she said, go on this site. And I thought, okay, well, I'm now off the plane. So I went on the site, and sure enough, there was a manifesto. And it was a manifesto signed by hundreds of IBM employees. And they were angry, and they were, just really angry. And the reason was that apparently IBM had said, we're no longer going to reimburse for Uber. And so I read all their comments, and I'm like, oh my God, how did this happen? People weren't able to, go see their clients, all kinds of things, right? And so I called up my head of operations, and I said, what's going on here? And he said, I don't know. So he quickly looked and came back and said, one of my employees saw that there was somebody whose luggage was stolen in Rome, and, the best of intentions went on the site and said, we're no longer reimbursing for Uber. 2013, 2014, I guess this person thought that was okay. But of course, it had created this uproar. So I went on the site and I said, hi, I'm your head of HR, and I've read all your comments, and they're really thoughtful. I've looked into it, and it was a case of someone having their luggage stolen. But on balance, of course, it will be important for all of us to be able to be reimbursed. And so I'm going to reverse the policy, and it's just been changed. And if you go on the site, you'll see that. Well, oh my goodness. I mean, the positive feedback that I got from that was enormous. But the next day, the headlines in Yahoo Finance and Business Insider were all about how IBM had responded within 24 hours to a concern that employees had, and wasn't that amazing? But the headlines could have been, what an idiot IBM was for doing this, right? So, it's that fine line, right? You've got to be on top of these things. Now, when I think about sentiment analysis, I think about it as high notes and low notes. Where are the high notes? That's great. Where are the low notes? And the low notes, you've got to go and look to see, ask your head of HR in that area or your HR business partner in that area to say, is there something going on that we need to know about? And then they can talk to people and find out, but not names, right? Just, is there an issue? In that particular case, there was a post, right, that had gathered a lot of attention. And so, it was a little different, but it does need to be anonymous, and it should just be to give you a sense of what's going on, but it can avoid some serious issues.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about the high notes and low notes, Diane, because it resonates a lot. I've heard from several corporate board members that I've had the chance to talk with about, they collectively believe that companies are pretty weak at really hearing, to your point, but they would say something like maybe the strong signals versus the weak signals, right? Or the high notes versus the low notes. What advice would you give to the people on this call here if you want to be a company that has that's much more attuned to the sentiment that's happening externally, internally? What would you communicate out to the workforce so as to be transparent, but also at the same time not create fear in people of this utopian society or whatever it might be?
Yeah, well, it's really important to have a set of guidelines to show people what your guardrails are. As I said before, this concept of anonymous is really important. And I think people are very suspicious of the term anonymous for good reason. Does that mean that you can still find me by my employee number? Things like that. And so you need to show how there is absolutely no way there'll be a large enough N that you would not be able to find that person. But you would be able to find a trend or a sentiment that is held by a large number of people, and whatever that N is, that's important to share. Is it 50? Is it 100? But it certainly isn't less than 50, right?
Yeah.
And so, so I think that's important. And then, as I said before, some form of governance. If you do need to go down to the individual level, who are the people who are going to make that decision? And are you going to have, employees involved in it? Because that's another way to do it. You might have, for example, a council of managers who have been, named by their employees as a fabulous manager. We had that at IBM. And so they advised us on a number of things. So those are the kinds of things that, draw more confidence that it's somebody who, we can trust, right? That we know. And so that's the sort of thing. And it could be governance in every city, in every country, whatever. It doesn't have to be just in corporate. But it is important to share, be transparent about how you're using it, where it comes from, what you look at, so that they feel more comfortable. And look, if you told an employee that if someone, threatened to put, to shoot someone in their workplace, they will sure agree that, they'd like you to know about that ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
So they have an interest as well.
Absolutely. I love the example you've shared before, getting back to like AI and its benefits to the business. Can you share with folks a little bit about how you've used it in the past, Diane, to help managers make better decisions, especially in this day and age when we've got so much emphasis on productivity, on efficiency, you name it?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we used it in a number of ways because we really felt like our managers were overburdened. There was just more and more being asked of managers in a world where you need to be empathetic and understand them and all sorts of things that maybe weren't as important in the old days, but certainly are so important now. And the other thing was we'd moved to self-service like everybody else, and it was incredibly burdensome because it was very process-centric and it wasn't helping them with their problem, right? So those were kind of the two things, an overload, but also, self-service that wasn't particularly sensitive to, the issues that they were dealing with, but more focused on the function itself and what they could do for you. So we did use AI, to help us pull from a number of different databases to help solve problems, right? And so, for example, a manager might say, I want to terminate this individual, separate this individual from the company. What do I need to do next? Okay, so before you have to go to a million websites and, what do you do around their, communication? What do you do around their benefits? Blah, blah, blah. And you had an HR partner who would be there for you, but wouldn't necessarily be an expert around disability benefits or anything like that. So we were able to pull that together in a way that would be helpful. Another one would be, I want to promote Kevin. What do I do? Well, before it was like, well, here's the link you have to go to, da da da. And instead it would be like, do you want me to do it for you? Here's the range, da da da. Or I want to transfer Kevin. And before it was very complicated. Now it's like, would you like us to do it for you? So it was very quick. It could be done in the middle of the night, blah, blah, blah. So that was helpful. The other thing that we did was we were, as I mentioned before, really making skills the cornerstone of everything we did. And so for compensation, we wanted to really make sure we were rewarding people who had the skills of the future. And so we built using AI, we built a compensation advisor for managers, so they would get their budget and it would tell them, how that was recommended that they spend their salary increase budget. And so it would take into account not just the employee's performance and their position versus, the market, but also the turnover rate of people with those skills in the company and the demand for those skills in the market. So scraping from job sites of competitors, and the demand for those skills in the future using our workforce plan. And so even though the person might have been a high performer or low in market position, if there was, a 0% turnover rate and a very low demand in the market and a very low demand looking out into the future, they wouldn't be recommended an increase. Well, in the old days, it was really hard for a manager to have that conversation because, hey, you're a high performer, but you haven't built new skills. And let's make sure we do that next year. Now they had all this data that they could share and say, you're not getting an increase. Here's why. We had these conversations about building your skills and it didn't happen this year and blah, 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 blah. And here's what's going on if you, continue not building out those skills. So it was, it turned out to be, a very good advisor for the manager. But, the manager didn't always take the recommendation. In some cases, they just went ahead and did what they wanted to do. But over the years, that's improved. And I think I saw Nicole, my successor, say that 80% of the managers now take the recommendation. I can't remember, it was 60 or 80. But anyway, it was high, but a lot higher than when we started.
I love that example. Tom, I am seeing some stuff happening in chat, but I am not paying attention because I'm listening to Diane and looking at her. Is there anything going on in the ether here we need to be aware of?
Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to prompt a nice message from Angela in the chat that's getting some thumbs up from others. I'll just summarize it for you, Diane, because I want to get your reaction to it. Noting that generative AI has a lot of powerful things it can do in HR, amplifying previous people analytics and so on. But a lot of the use cases Angela has seen, and we've seen this as well, is doing things like using it to draft job descriptions. And that's great. It can be an efficiency boost for the recruiting team and for hiring managers, but it can also produce a lot of similarity and sort of generic job descriptions out there, and thereby, as Angela says, dampen your EVP, dampen your culture voice that you want to have to better differentiate you from other employers. So what are your thoughts on that? The fact that overuse of generative AI might make everyone sort of the same.
Yeah. So Angela, good for you for spotting that. Yeah, I mean, it enables people also to know that they got it, it was generated by Gen AI, right? So it's another like, oh, they don't really care too much about this. And it reminds me of when Southwest Airlines first started to have like really individualistic flight attendants, right? And people are like, whoa, that's great. They're finally cracking jokes, and people like it. It's refreshing, and it's their character. They put their character into the script that they gave their employees, which was be yourself, right? And I think people really value that. So I agree. I think that's really good. Look, I think we're in early stages of how companies are using Gen AI. The way I think about it is there are really 4 areas, that are really being affected. One we've just talked about, which is it can give you an X-ray of your culture and your skills, right? And that's incredibly helpful as an HR function. The second one, which is where Angela, you're talking about, is where it can be a co-pilot to somebody who's got a job and wants some of the job to be done for them. And it doesn't stop that person from, making changes, right? They shouldn't just, out it goes, because it, as you say, it loses their individuality, but it also may have mistakes. And we've heard a lot about hallucinations, which is just another word for saying screwing up. And so you do need to, have some personal touch there. The thing that I thought was really interesting in this space is the BCG study that was done on BCG consultants by Harvard and MIT professors, and they did a very solid study of 700 or so consultants, and they looked at the normal day-to-day of a consultant's work, which involves analysis but also creativity, right? And what they found was that it upped the productivity, not just analysis, but also, or research, but also innovation of these consultants quite considerably. But the thing that really was interesting was it upped the productivity of the low performers more than the high performers. The low performers, in terms of the volume and quality of their work, which was measured by, an individual, against where they had been before they used AI, right? So it was sort of how did they improve? They'd had a pre-experiment exercise to do, and then they did it with AI. For the low performers, it went up 43%, and for the high performers, their productivity and quality went up 17%. So so that really kind of opens the aperture to say, all right, so it's really having a bigger effect on low performers. There's actually narrowing the gap between low and high performers. Well, should we carry on having performance-based pay then? I mean, these are the kinds of questions we should be asking in HR, right? The other thing that I think is something we need to watch out for is, it's very easy to delegate tasks, just like writing a job description, to your Gen AI friend. However, it's taking away the kind of work that we all did when we were juniors, right? That's how we learned our craft. And I worry that we need to be thinking through what a junior career track looks like. When, the senior people might no longer be asking them to do some of this kind of work, but will instead find it easier, faster to ask their Gen AI tool to do. And so I do think that's something we need to be thinking about in HR, and it's a little troublesome. It's a little troublesome, I think. The other area we've talked about is automation, and I think we're all seeing that and the upskilling opportunity that's there. And I think HR has a role to play around how we do that, so that people feel involved, feel a level of ownership for the new work design. But the other thing is, HR has never really been strong in work design, and we're going to need to get a whole lot better as we integrate AI and Gen AI into work. And the flow of information is really important to understand. And that, of course, all lies behind the job description. So it goes back to fundamental skills in HR that we need to focus on. The last area, the fourth area that I see it really making a difference is the employee experience and the manager experience. And I mentioned, the experience that we were able to create at IBM, but, to be able to create a wow experience and doing stuff for people is really, really important. And it has to be things that matter to them, right? One of the first things we used AI for in IBM, which really lessened the manager's workload, was expense reimbursement. Expense approvals. And that was a real pain. Every time one of your employees went to a trip, you had to go and approve every one of their expenses. And if you had a lot of those employees who were traveling, that was a lot of work. And you probably didn't spend enough time on it to make sure everything was A-okay. So we actually trained our system to look for fraud and pattern finding. And so we said to our managers back in 2013, we said, from now on, you no longer have to approve an expense. It'll only come back to you if the system finds that there's an aberration of some kind. And they couldn't believe it. I mean, suddenly this come off their plates. And they were just so happy about it, right? And it worked for us. It really did work for us. It found evidence, much more evidence actually than we'd ever had before. So it was quite helpful, and it would come back and suggest other remediation approaches as well.
Just going back to the skills piece for a moment, because
Yeah.
this is, I would venture to guess if we polled this audience here that at least half would say, yeah, we're doing something around being a more skills-based organization going forward. And can you give advice to the people on this call, whether they're a smaller organization or a larger organization? What are some talent practices or cultural components? If you're moving to being a skills-based organization, what are some key lessons you've learned that they should incorporate or build off?
Yeah. So I think the key is you have all your management systems at your disposal and use them all, right? And so, so first of all, recognition, right? We got a lot out of having digital badges. And so people would put them on LinkedIn. You probably see them all the time when people have a digital badge. And it's a form of recognition that gives you social status in some way, people recognize you for it, they congratulate you, kind of fun, right? So that I think has been tremendously helpful. The second one is a compensation, as I mentioned, to make sure that if you've improved your skills, is recognized in some way in your compensation, if it's a skill that the company values, blah, blah, blah. And so, that's important. The third one is managers, right? So we actually rewarded managers if the skills of their unit had improved year to year. And we looked at the areas of skills that were critical to the business and said, have they improved or not? And by the way, we also had one, back to your point, Kevin, of movement within and outside. So have you moved your employees on to better opportunities outside your organization? So people weren't just like holding people they trained. So we looked at both, but so that was important. And so, obviously internal movement, we had an opportunity marketplace, and that was all based on skills, not just based on experience or credentials. We changed, as you probably know, we changed our job requisitions, and they no longer use degrees for hiring, because what we were really looking for were skills, and we knew we could build those skills if people exhibited the right characteristics. So these, it's everything in your quiver, it's all there. You can all make it happen. And of course, it has to start from the top, right? And so role modeling from the top. I mean, there's nothing better than having, a town hall with your people to say, oh my God, that, last module was so gruesome. I didn't think I'd pass, or I tried it 3 times and then I finally passed. And they go, oh, you've been doing that too. So it's important that you share your experiences when you're training, because we all have to train, and the CEO down, right? And so all of us at a senior level, we all talked about the training and what we were doing when we had town halls or met with employees.
I was just writing something. We just did a big study with Upskill America on upskilling frontline workers. And one of the things that I was writing, and part of this report is, one of the key traits we've always seen in high performance organizations is a culture of continuous learning. But one of the foremost things of a culture of a continuous learning is really 3-way accountability for learning. And one is, where the leader is really demonstrating learning's importance. They're a leader of, they're teaching others. They're doing exactly what you're doing. They're learning themselves and coming back and sharing frustrations or how it's benefited them. I just wanted to reference that. I think that's so important, Diane. Hey, Diane, do you feel, I just wonder this, and then just wanted to get your sense if you think to the future here, especially for HR. One of the questions I saw come up in chat, and I hear this often, is, we're not good as an organization at anticipating skills that we're going to need going forward. Was there anything that you did at IBM or that you've seen others do that you would recommend, especially for a company that may not have all kinds of resources, as to what's effective to try to anticipate that better?
For the company or for HR?
Well, you know what? Let's say for the company here, more broadly for the company.
Yeah, so for the company, it starts with the business strategy, right? And to be able to break down the business strategy into so what skills we're going to need and which ones are we going to need less of, right? Most companies are constantly changing their portfolio and they're changing the way they work. And so it is important to be on top of that and to be able to do that translation. And that was a very rigorous process we went through at least once a year. And then we were able to share with employees, here are the skills we're going to need less of, here are the skills we're going to need more of. And we also looked at the market and said, oh, by the way, this is what's going on in the market. So people who were in an area where we needed less of, but the market was strong, that was a good indicator that you might want to, find another job before we decide that we need fewer of those jobs. And then unless they wanted to reskill. And we showed them where there were adjacencies where they could reskill or upskill into the areas where there would be high demand. So, got to be transparent about all that. But yeah, it was a very, very important exercise. And did we always get it right? Probably not. But directionally, it was good and it enabled us to coach people, give them, of course, we had a great AI-based learning system, so they were able to see, hey, your skill is adjacent to this high demand skill. Do you want to start that course? And so, so they were constantly aware of, how they could get into a better place with their skills.
Fantastic.
For the HR perspective, I think this is a very interesting time for HR. I saw somebody's note in the chat there about, HR are monkeys and anyone can do our job. I think it's really putting a premium on what HR has always been good at, which is EQ. The one thing that we found with Gen AI, and we found this in the study that I just remarked on that was done by Harvard and MIT, and if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. It's called The Jagged Edge. And what they found was one of the exercises was, to make a recommendation to a CEO based on, a lot of data around this particular product and market. But there were interview notes and then there was the data, right? And so Gen AI came back with the wrong recommendation. Why? Because it couldn't tease out the subtlety that was in the interviews, which actually contradicted some of the data. But a person could see that if they had the right EQ to pick up the subtlety. So it's that skill that is really at a premium, not just for HR, but really everywhere. And the other thing is that, you could have as your co-pilot somebody who, is an AI as opposed to a robot, as opposed to a person, but you don't get that level of ability to share your thinking and to get, it's that companionship, right? Of, I think you're on the right road there, but here, take courage and go do it, right? That's the kind of thing maybe an HR person would say. So I think it's that EQ part that is going to matter much more going into the future. And the question that we've got to get really good at as HR people is, how do you screen for that? How do you select for it? And if people aren't that strong in it, how do you develop it? And that, I think, is going to become more and more important. I also mentioned other areas like work and job design, which is critical as we start to rethink how work gets done. And then, I think the ability to work with the analytics is important. There's no question, the other areas that AI can do for us require somebody to interpret it and to turn it into policy and to turn it into feedback and that kind of thing.
Well, I just knowing what time it is right now, I'm going to hold back from any other questions, Diane, because this could go on forever. But again, it teases up why you need to be in Scottsdale at the end of March. But Tom, I'm going to turn things back to you. And I just want to thank you, Diane, for this conversation. It's been fascinating.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, time certainly flies. Great to have you with us, Diane. That was an illuminating conversation. You got a lot of thumbs up and kudos from folks that are streaming in here in the chat. So thanks again, and thanks, Kevin, for facilitating such a great conversation today. A couple minutes left. Just want to remind folks that these sessions, Next Practices Weekly, every week are good for recertification credit hours. So if you're an HR professional with a cert from either HRCI or SHRM, just jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID here for this week's session. Those, of course, vary from week to week, so you need to be here at the end to pick those up. And then one time, again, just a plug, you see Diane's face and name there at the top left, alongside many other great speakers that we've got coming up. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Hold on.
You're in the top
No,
left,
you're not.
Tom. You're great face.
I'm up there in the top left. Sorry
Yeah.
about that. So let me back up. I think it's probably been put in the chat as well. Here again is that program ID and activity ID for the HRCI and SHRM certifications. And then, as I was saying, great lineup of speakers as we've been plugging the Next Practices Now conference. The hotel in particular, the Fairmont Princess, is filling up fast. We have no real cap, though, on attendance. So if you're an HR leader who would like to see what the best HR conference is like each year, come join us on March 25th through 28th in Scottsdale, Arizona, and hear from not only Diane, but all of these outstanding book authors, CEOs, CHROs, other HR leaders. It's going to be a great time. All right. Well, thanks again, Diane. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Zeta. And thanks, everyone, for participating today on the call. See you again next Thursday for our next Practices Weekly. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks.